Thanks so much for being a
This
guest on the
is a Michael
show.
Brian
Those
show.
that are listening, feel free to subscribe, share the show, tell others, and also leave a
Hi
review
everyone,
wherever you
welcome
are
back to the
listening
show,
into
and I
your
am joined with
podcasts.
Dan Berger, who is a hospitality entrepreneur. He's also an author, and his book is The Quest, which is a way of finding belonging and connecting, and he even dives into things of connecting within a technology-based society. So, Dan, thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you, Michael.
So I wonder how you actually got started in this, because I know you've got a lot of experience as an entrepreneur and a business owner. So I wonder how you started on your quest.
Um, yeah, what a wonderful way to start this recording. Uh, the answer is, and I'm not being cute. The answer is I was in the womb when I started this quest, and the reason for that is because when I was when I was a fetus, in my mom's belly, my biological mom, she made the decision to give me up for adoption. And what happened at that point is that at least the story I tell myself is that, and this what this and what the science backs is that my biological mom was communicating to me that I don't belong with her or with her family. And that's really what I believe started my deep search for my sense of belonging, that has now been going on for 43 years because that's how old I am. Technically 44 if you count those 9 months like I'm talking about. And throughout my life, I always tried to find my sense of belonging in different ways that I didn't really understand, that was just intuitive for me. And it was only about 3 years ago when I found myself in a bit of a hiatus, what I call my halftime. Um, and that when I started to really dig deeply and research the issue of belonging and scientifically understand how I find belonging and subsequently share that with other people.
Do you find then that there are any common themes around people that struggle with this? Because I imagine it's either a subconscious thing or things that people are very aware of. Are there any common themes that you've noticed?
Yes. Um, and again, what it is, I'm not just, you know, kind of flattering you. It is a great question because we oftentimes don't think about what did we do not as well as we should have. And one of those is, Michael, is this what I refer to as hand-me-down belonging. It's when we take activities that should give us a sense of belonging and we do them because someone expects us to do them. So a very specific example is a lot of parents, especially in the United States, push their kids to do sport. But many kids may not want to do sport. And the parents really push their kids to do it for their sake, not really for the kids' sake, or at least that's the truth behind it. Of course, they mean well. They believe that sport may help them become more confident, become better teammates, help their physical health. Although that is true, but it's not necessarily what the kid may want. Another example is what I call misconceived belonging. It's when we do something that we think gives us a sense of belonging, but is actually does not actually give us a sense of belonging. An example of that is when we go to work and we think, oh, our job gives us a sense of belonging. And the reality is that it doesn't. The job is a platform for relationships that give us a sense of belonging. So that's misconceived belonging. And the last kind of what I call fake belonging summit is when we are mates with people who used to give us a sense of belonging, but no longer do. And we kind of can't shake that off for different reasons. It might be because we think we enjoy them. It might be because we're scared of the repercussions of leaving them. So those are the three kind of categories for how people don't use the tools they have to find their sense of belonging, and they kind of fall on things that are not necessarily great for them.
That's an interesting concept, I guess, where you're doing things with this notion of, I guess, finding your belonging or feeling like you're somewhat connected to other people. But then what ends up happening is the tools that you think work don't actually work. Why would you say that is usually the case? And then as a second part to that, it's almost like people would feel almost more lonely by doing these things.
I mean, I think you're right. I just think that nobody is taught about belonging, and it's kind of something we take for granted. There's a reason why we refer to it as a sense of belonging, and that's because it is like a sixth sense. It's something we feel, and we can't always put words to it. We can't always put our finger on it, but it is something we feel. Um, and that's because it's an innate human need. It's a fundamental need that we have that has not really been considered a a part of our our needs to be a functioning adult. So that's why I think a lot of people have not necessarily paid attention to it, and now kind of get to this point in our society where they're isolated and lonely. And I know in the UK, this has been an issue, at a very kind of at a very societal level where people are having these conversations from a health perspective. So around loneliness and isolation, and we see it around the world with incel movement and male loneliness is an epidemic and so on.
Is there any reasons why it's probably more noticeable in men than women, perhaps? Are there any things that can tie to that? Because I picture it as being more of a general thing, but I know that it's almost more noticeable in men.
Oh man. Okay. Well, um, the reason why it's more prevalent with men, there are several reasons. The first one is because society's been going through a shift where feminism has been very successful and rightfully so. But men feel like they're being left behind. And I'm not saying that's right or wrong. I'm just saying what they feel. And I'm not going to justify that feeling. I'm not going to try to explain it away. It's a result of more equality and equity in a society. So that's the first reason why men feel more isolated. Furthermore, it's gotten even worse in terms of dating, where, I think it's like 90%. I may mistake here the numbers, but it's a disproportionate number of men that don't match with women on dating apps. And they're just not meeting the right partner. And again, that I'm not going to comment on any of the dating apps and what needs to be done differently. It's just a reality that people are getting married later and men don't feel in control of that. And the reason that's important for belonging is because our family, our nuclear family, the family we build, is in a very important part of belonging. It's those interpersonal relationships that we have with our partner and our kids and our parents. But parents age and we become alone. And that's further related to the fact that women find belonging differently than men sometimes. But the science tells us that more women place their children ahead of their jobs or their spouse. And that's not always true for men. So men just find belonging a little differently. And another example of that is in group dynamics. Men need to be in groups and have shared experiences in order to have a set feeling of belonging, while women need to have intimate relationships or close relationships with just a few girlfriends, and just men are not a part of those kinds of groups. That's why we see so many men's groups popping up. So those are the reasons why men are more impacted than women by this plague.
It's an interesting point actually that you bring up equity and that we're trying to, I guess, keep everybody at an even position. So those that need more help get it, those that need less help get that as well, in the sense of we're trying to lift the people up that need it. It's an interesting point where those that feel like they're not necessarily met, their needs aren't being met, is usually because we're trying to focus on those that are more needy or of the help, those that need it the most usually try and get it, but then we don't really think of the other side of that.
That's right. I mean, that's where the term the squeaky wheel gets the grease comes from. And you hit on a very important point, which is the difference between equity and equality. Equality is 50-50. Equity is contextual division based off of the environment and the needs of each group. So you're right. While we lift one group up, we can't bring another group down or forget those previous groups.
So is there a sense then of we need to be a bit more careful of the consequences of that? Where, okay, even though we're having a heavy focus over here, we still need to check in with the opposing side, so to speak, and say, look, we're going to focus over here, but you need to let us know if you're feeling like you're having things taken away from you, in the sense of we're building one up, but then we are inadvertently letting one go.
Well, that's why I put together my guide. I used the process that I walk readers through, which I'll share in a second, is exactly what I did in order to address my issues. Because when I sold my company, my sense of belonging, which was fake, really, because all my belonging was met through my company, disappeared. So I went through this, I studied it, and I decided to kind of open source my process, and it's quite simple. I mean, the first thing that happens is that people need to take inventory of how they currently find belonging. And belonging is the feeling of being seen, valued, and respected in any environment that we're in. And it's mutual. So, in other words, we feel a sense of belonging and we experience a sense of belonging. And when so not just do we feel it, but also we experience it, which means other people give us signals, or other things in the environment give us signals that we belong. So it is kind of this symbiotic relationship between the individuals and then the individual and the environment they're in. So the first thing is to really identify the areas in which we find belonging. And there are 6 areas we can find belonging in. If you'd like, I can cover them. And then after we identify those activities, which I summarize, I think there's like 30 or 40 of them in total, while there are 6 major categories. Once we do that, I call that the belonging tank. We kind of see what fills our tank, and then we identify what's our belonging persona, our belonging archetype. There are 4 belonging archetypes. There is the eager belonger, represented by a chimpanzee. There is the anxious belonger, represented by a meerkat. There is the reluctant belonger, represented by a snow leopard, and there is an independent belonger, represented by a wolf. So once we know what our belonging archetype is, we can tell. I then share which strategies work best for each archetype, and then we can revisit our belonging tank to make sure that we're doing the right things, and we can add things we want to experiment with. I then go on into slightly more advanced tactics like developing skills for belonging, such as rejection navigation, or hobby exploration. And then I go into an environmental scan in order to change the 9 different categories of our life that will open up more opportunities and kind of create an intervention for more belonging in our life.
I like how you mention the archetypes because it's almost like the strategy for belonging in a way that feels real is likely a personal thing. Like it's different from person to person, personality to personality. It's a very personal experience for people.
That's right. And if you think about it, the names of each of the personalities make sense from a visual perspective. So, for example, a chimpanzee who's an eager belonger needs to be around people, gets validation from people. Those individuals are at the top right of the matrix because they have a high need to belong, which is scientifically measurable, and they have a secure attachment style, which again is an independent psychological construct. So because they have a secure attachment style, they can build relationships. They get validation from those relationships. And you think about chimpanzees; they're up in the trees having fun as a big group. They're mating, they're playing, they're fighting. Um, while meerkats are at the top left because they have a high need to belong, but an insecure attachment style. So even though they are living in groups, they're always on the lookout for threats when they stick their head out of the ground and they're looking around. So they're anxious and they need find belonging. Perhaps a little differently. They have to develop more trust in the relationships before they can really be vulnerable. Um, so again, the personas really color and inform how we find belonging.
This might be a strange question to ask, and I am probably thinking that there's not one answer, but in this sense of healthy and unhealthy relationships and activities and behavior, possibly edging towards negative consequences, I wonder if there is a more healthy archetype to be? Like, is there a goal? Is there anything that you would strive towards being? Because if you have something that relies on people, that's all well and good until you're on your own, sort of thing. It's a weird example. But is there anything that you would consider healthier in terms of the belonging side of things?
There is, and that's the wolf. And the reason for that is because a wolf has a secure attachment style, but a low or medium need to belong. And the reason that is quote unquote better is because they have to do less things to feel like they belong, and they choose what they can do because they find belonging in those in different paths that other archetypes may not have as much variety. So I like to think of the wolf as either part of the wolf pack or being a lone wolf. They can be on their own, independent. That's why it's the independent belonger, independently finding belonging through paths like contemplative practices or symbolic bonds or um, micro interactions, these kind of small interactions with people that are not really deep. Um, or or things that give them self-esteem. Um, and those don't always require like deep relationships. So wolves are quote unquote better because they can either do stuff with other people or they can do stuff on their own.
It sounds to me then like they need to be quite secure in themselves or quite happy with their own company, sort of thing. Like if it's not very reliant on pretty much anything.
That's right. They can call the shots because they have a secure attachment style, which means that they're not really codependent. They're not worried somebody's going to leave them or abandon them. And that means that they can just have healthier relationships. And having a low need to belong means you can have less things in your fuel tank, your belonging fuel tank.
Is there a sense of being able to shift these archetypes then? Because if that's the quote unquote goal of it, where you're not overly attached to things unless you want to, there seems to be a lot more proactive nature happening with the wolf. Like it's more independent, it's more down to them. How can we shift that? If you're starting to get a sense of, okay, maybe I'm being too reliant on other people, maybe I'm reliant on this particular individual to fuel my tank, how can people make the shifts and the adjustments?
Fantastic question. So the answer is it's difficult yet possible. So the first thing is, and I talk about this in the book, is that a lot of people that can't really control what their genetics are, and half of our happiness. I mean, why are we after this belonging thing? And that's because it gives us more joy. It's different than happiness in that joy is a state, and by having a strong sense of belonging, we can be living a life of joy as opposed to the peaks and valleys of happiness. So um, the the first thing is to understand your genetic set point, which again covers 50% of your of your happiness. And it's very hard. You may have heard the term people don't change or can't change. It's somewhat true, but there are ways to influence your genetic set point, or I should say not influence, correct it. And those who have a negative disposition can do really three things, maybe four, depending how you count it. The first is um, cognitive behavioral therapy. And there are different modalities today than ever, more than ever. But that takes a lot of work. The second is meditation and contemplative practices, which just deepen or increase our level of consciousness, and then make us realize we we are we are more complicated than just the definition of the people we know or whatnot. And the third is psychotropics, whether it's pharmaceuticals or psychedelics, in order to change our state. So that's the first thing people can do, and that will have an influence on on our attachment style. And our attachment style then moves us from the left side of the quadrants, where it's insecure attachments, towards a more secure attachment, which is the right side of our matrix, where the chimp and the wolf live. So that's really what folks can do. Our need to belong is much more genetically programmed, so that's a little harder to do. However, people can consider different belonging paths that may be better for them. So that it's really about doing the things that fill our sense of belonging, regardless if it's high or low, and not doing things that don't.
Are there any examples of the opposite side of that? So someone that would consider themselves secure, possibly someone that would identify as the wolf side of things. What about if they start to find themselves becoming attached to things in a deeper level? Do you have any examples of that where they have to almost undo that element to maintain the wolf archetype?
Yeah, that's a great question. I really haven't thought about that, Michael. I think the answer is probably um, constantly checking in on your fuel tank. That's why on the cover of my book, um, I have a mountain, and the goal is to get to the summit, obviously. But once we get to the summit of belonging, our goal is to stay there. The summit gives us perspective. It allows us to see what's around us more clearly. It allows us to see how we got there, perhaps look at different ways we could have gotten there. So when we're at the summit of belonging, just to continue this analogy, we need to stay there. And in order to stay there, we have to constantly, or I should say regularly, review our belonging fuel tank and adjust it and manage it and edit it as needed in order to stay at the summit. So, for example, as you grow older, you may not have the same opportunities you've had when you were younger. And that's just because our crossroad moments, these kind of moments we have in our life for really fundamental change, are not as prevalent. You know, we may be married, we may be stuck where we are because of our job. We have had our education, so we're not starting school. Our kids are out of the home, so we're not really meeting new people or having new experiences because of their schooling. So opportunities for transformation become more limited. And that can be a good thing or a bad thing, depending on how aligned your fuel tank is with your archetype.
That's a good point, actually, because obviously, as life goes on, as we get older, as our connections change, as people move, it becomes this moving goal, I guess, where now all of a sudden the opportunities are less, or one of your best friends emigrates to a different country, and then you need to reset and re-establish things. Do you find then that having some elements that you're aware of, i.e., let's say, you do have the deeper connections with people, and that's one of the things that, maintains your tank and keeps you feeling this sense of joy. If you're aware of that, if things move and things change, you kind of know what to do. Like, oh, this person's moved, or I can no longer spend as much time with this person. I need to find something that can, quotes, fill this gap or fill this need that I need to feel this sense of joy again.
Yeah, and that's exactly where a belonging mindset comes in, which is what I urge people to kind of consider when you start thinking about, okay, does this give me a sense of belonging? Or at least does this continue to give me a sense of belonging? And if not, edit it. And a lot of folks just kind of go through the motions of living their life to the best of their ability without taking a moment to pause and say, hey, is that group or is that association still serving me? Um, are the people in my life still the right people, or should I add new people? I don't think people should just kick people out of their lives. They can just add new ones, and they'll slowly replace the old ones. So, like for me, for example, as I've kind of leaned into my Jewish religion, I have found that perhaps I want to be closer with folks who share the same religious identity as me. So that is an example of how I've kind of explored a different group that I really wasn't considering in the past. Or, I got married and I had a daughter. So certainly my fuel tank changed because that's been the predominant fuel. So having this belonging mindset allows us to, not necessarily in real time, but in almost near time, be cognizant over whether activities give us belonging or not, and start, considering new ones. And in order to do that, I developed this very, very simple kind of 5-step framework, and the framework is basically I call it the 5 C's. The first one is, I forget, I'll forget some of them perhaps, but the first one is charged. Does does this fuel give me energy? The second one, I forget the C word, the C word that it starts with, but the second one is around whether intuitively we feel like this is a good tank for us. Another one is committed. Are we committed to this tank? Another one is, are we kind of shouting it from the rooftops? Are we proud of it or not? And I forget the fifth one, but those are the kind of ways we can evaluate our the fuel tanks we're using to see if they still serve us. And if not, we can explore new ones, because that fuel tank has a capacity. If it's full, there's not much more we can add. Some people need, the average number of fuels people have is around 7.5 or 8, but the range is 2 to 17. My fuel tank, because I'm an anxious belonger or a meerkat, has a ton of fuels in it. And I've been editing it my whole life, most of it unbeknownst to me. So that, hopefully that answers your question about how folks can keep that belonging mindset throughout their lives.
It sounds like we need to go on a self-awareness journey to be able to do all of these things. It sounds like the tools are nice to have, but if we don't know which ones are serving you as an individual, things can get quite confusing or complicated. How would you suppose people become more self-aware to make this whole conversation that we've gone through so far that little bit easier?
I just want to quickly jump to the last question first, and that is the 5 C's, and I just looked them up. So the first one is certainty, and that's the instinctive kind of feeling we have if a fuel serves us. Next is charge, which I talk about. Does it give us energy? The third one is connected. Can we be genuine when we show up participating in it? The fourth is celebrated if we take pride in participating in it. And the fifth is championed. Are we championing it, and are we proud to share it with other people? Going back to your self-awareness question, certainly self-awareness plays a role in any self-help or personal development or personal growth kind of field. Self-awareness in the quest for belonging is really just about your belonging archetype, and it's really being aware of it, which requires you being aware of your need to belong, which is a very simple test, as well as your attachment style, which again is a very simple test. And if anybody goes on belongingquest.com/quiz, they can go ahead and take a very simple quiz, and I give you the results of your belonging archetype, and I even tell you what to do. So everybody can go do this without even picking up the book.
How about in this age of technology then, Dan? It seems like things are taking a bit of a turn. Technology's becoming a little bit more prevalent, and I feel like everyone's using their phones or their laptops and things of that nature. How would you suppose in this growing age of technology that we can still feel this sense of belonging? Because I heard someone say, I think it was last week, where technology and relationships tends to keep people at a set distance away from them, meaning we only ever know so much about an individual. That can make things very tricky and complicated. So how do you suppose we can navigate that?
Michael, there are many experts who talk about technology, and I certainly don't pretend to be one. So I will leave a lot of the advice to them. I will say, however, that the cat's out of the bag. That when it comes to technology, there's entropy, and in other words, it can't be put back in the bottle. So we just have to adjust with the reality in which we live in, as opposed to put the phone away or whatever people are advising. That's just not realistic. And so we have to adjust. And the answer then is to actually use technology as a tool to strengthen our sense of belonging. Allow me to explain. Um, so I I talked about the different paths to belong. And like I said, there are six different kind of major categories. The first three are in the traditional category. It's what you would expect, right? It's interpersonal relationships. It's uh, it's experiences, kind of whether it's attending concerts like Glastonbury, or whether it's being a part of a group. That's kind of group membership and collective experiences. Um, the third in the traditional category is casual, what I call casual encounters or micro interactions. It's just seeing people, waving to neighbors, being a part of a neighborhood or a kind of a routine. So those are the traditional paths. The non-traditional paths are what I touched on them. It's meditative or it's contemplative practices, which could be meditation or stargazing or whatever, or travel, whatever gives you a sense of wonder and awe. The second is self-esteem, and those are things that make us feel better about ourselves. Sometimes it's driving a luxury car. Sometimes it's getting an award. Sometimes it's wearing a certain brand. Um, and the sixth, and probably most important in the technological age, is symbolic bonds. And these are bonds we have with people that we don't necessarily know. It can be fictional characters, it can be influencers, it can be Thomas Shelby from Peaky Blinders, who I have a very strong connection with, even though I've never met him, or Mr. Murphy is the actor who plays him. So it's about in the age of the internet and technology, we can strengthen our sense of belonging. And many people, for example, by the way, do it by having accounts on Reddit and having conversations. People are on Discord talking to people they've never met. People are in Facebook groups that they're just passionate about around in a shared interest. And the thing about the technology is that there's so many options. We just try to do everything. And again, we have to take this approach of editing our fuel tank to really focus on the technological paths that give us a sense of belonging, which is kind of hard to avoid these days. So I hope that answers the question. If I sound cynical about the future, it's because I am. The reality is that until AI and robotics get really good, and it will happen, we still need people. And that's why I started my new company. And my new company is building retreat venues in the United States in small cities for 8 to 12 people. So in a hybrid world where people don't see each other at work, they can come together for an offsite or a quarterly meeting somewhat regularly to have that connection with people. So my advice is not that novel, and it's basically either lean into the technology or lean into the interpersonal relationships that give us intimacy and vulnerability.
It's an interesting point when you brought up that sometimes we can find belonging by using the technology, and I think there's an element of flexibility in how people can feel connected and feel like they belong, in that we should allow them to use technology if that's what they need.
That's right. I mean, that was the promise of the internet, and more recently, Facebook. Right? It was about this kind of social network. That's why it was called social media, social network. The word social is there. I understand many people think these companies are evil, and I tend to actually kind of agree. But I think that's because they're doing their fiduciary responsibility to shareholders. Um, there are glimmers of belonging there if we find the right way to do it. And having 3,000 friends makes it really hard to connect with people that may have come in your life, even 1,000 people. So, what the first thing I'd say, and I've done it myself, is unfollow on Facebook, for example, anybody you really don't give a shit about. And now my feed is actually people I care about. Um, it's very easy to kind of fall into the doom scroll by seeing other people's lives that where we feel like voyeurs. It's different when you scroll through people you actually care about. So that's a tiny example of how we can take the tools we have and use them to our advantage. It is becoming increasingly harder though. Um, but at the root of it, as you hinted earlier on, is that self-awareness. So at least we can watch for the pitfalls that may exist, and we stop using these fake belonging fuels that we think give us belonging, but they don't.
As one final question, I wonder, outside of trying to follow people that are more interesting or people that you're more interested in, are there any other tools or strategies for building connection and belonging, but in a future world? So maybe using technology, perhaps not using technology. What are some of the ways that we can connect with people, but think sort of 5, maybe 10 years ahead? What are the useful strategies for that?
So I have a little section in my book called How to Make Friends. And the answer to that is there are three factors for friendship. And there are three different types of friendships. So allow me to share that. The first factor actually, let me start with the categories of friendship. The first category is seasonal friendships. Those are friendships that we have for a season, and then perhaps at, at university or school or the work we may have been in, and those come and go, just like the seasons. The second is reason, and that's we have a reason to be friends. Maybe we're both single and we're going out to have a beer, or maybe we need to be friends because our partners are friends with them. And the third is lifetime. And there aren't many of these. Everybody thinks there are many of these. There aren't many of these. Um, there's a lot of research about like how many friends we can have, and actually, the the there are numbers around it. People may have heard the 140 people in our network. There's how many people we can have in our support circle. There is the amount of time we can spend with them. I'm going to stay away from all that because people can look that up, and there are much smarter people than me talking about this stuff. But so now that I've covered what are the different types of friendships, let me talk about how to make those friends. The first factor is this kind of mutual understanding and empathy. We can't be friends with somebody whose shoes we can't imagine walking in. Um, that's where connection grows and trust is built. So unless we're able to share that 5% with people, then it's not really worth having trying to develop that friendship. At least if we don't want it to be superficial. Um, the second is there has to be shared interests, activities, and consciousness. And what I mean by that is there has to be something that brings us together. And that can be our love for, artisanal coffee. It can be our love for the outdoors. It can be our love for anime. But it has to be something that brings us together. And in fact, it's those shared activities where we can meet other people. But I'll warn listeners that just having something in common is not enough. You need to have multiple things in common. So, for example, we can both be scuba divers. Doesn't mean we're going to be friends. We can both be scuba divers who are who scuba dive on their own while their spouse is at home, and we're both the same age category, and maybe we're both podcast hosts. So that gives us a few kind of levels of connection. And also, this includes consciousness. We can't be close to people whose consciousness where we don't share consciousness. So if somebody's in a state of apathy or a state of anger, which is really the same thing, or a state of sadness, and we're at this kind of other state, perhaps more elevated, it's really hard to be friends with them and develop a connection. Of course, we can mentor them and pull them up with us, but if they're stuck in that state, it's really hard to develop a close relationship with them. And finally, that kind of third factor is around consistency and reliability. It's not my Aristotle. It's not my quote. A friend is another self. That's what he said, and that is really true. It's that we are friends with people who are similar to us, unlike spouses, where we want people who are opposite from us, or at least a little different. And when I say consistency and reliability, it means we regularly care for each other. We really, and if it's a lifetime friendship, you don't necessarily need to have that regular consistency, but making sure we make friendship a practice is really important. We got to show up, and that's both in difficult times as well as in everyday life. So those are the three ways to develop friendships, and I think that's a really important piece of filling our belonging tank and kind of strengthening our sense of belonging.
I completely agree with that, and I wonder if there's a sense where if you're able to use these to your advantage, then it sounds like life gets easier, and it's easier to be more, I guess, joyful around your day. You mentioned happiness can be different to joy as well, but it sounds like the journey becomes easier once you're aware of these things.
That's absolutely right. And that's because it's a safety net. It gives us confidence that if we fall, we will be caught. And that is really important for us to develop relationships and a healthy sense of belonging. The Harvard longevity study, which began in 1938 and is run by a gentleman named Robert Waldinger, says that everybody needs at least one or two people to count on. And when they have that, they live healthier, happier, and longer lives. And the same is true for belonging. Belonging is connected to all those things. And if people focus on their sense of belonging as an independent skill that needs to be sharpened every day, then they will have really good outcomes and really more joyful lives.
That's a fantastic way to finish, Dan. I really enjoyed this. This has been fascinating. I wondered if those listening would like to enter your world, possibly even buy the book. How can people connect with you and find out more about what you're up to?
Well, I appreciate anybody who supports my work. And if any listener wants a free copy of the book, the digital copy, I'm happy to send it. They can find me at danjberger.com. That's DANJ, like in Joseph, Berger, BERGER.com. On all the socials as Dan Berger. And the reason I wrote my book is to help people struggling with belonging like I have my whole life. And that's why I'm happy to share the book with any listener who wants a free copy, because at the end of the day, that's my goal.
Thanks so much for being a guest on the show. Those that are listening, feel free to subscribe, share the show, tell others, and also leave a review wherever you are listening into your podcasts.
Dan, thanks so much. It's been fantastic. I've enjoyed it, and I look forward to keeping in touch. Thank you.
Thank you.